In the tense stillness of the courtroom, the gavel had barely touched the block when the air seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken tension. A sharp voice, laced with disdain and authority, pierced through the fragile calm. The officer speaking, his uniform immaculate and his arrogance radiating even more sharply than the badge he wore, leaned forward. His cold, unyielding eyes locked onto the woman seated at the bench. "Your Honor," he began, the title dripping with sarcasm so biting it cut through the room like a blade. "Are we really going to pretend that someone like you can grasp the weight of this case? Someone who, not too long ago, wouldn't have been allowed past the front doors of this building, let alone sitting there." The courtroom froze, every muscle tensed, every breath held. The insult was as blatant as it was cruel, an attack not just on her authority, but on her very identity. Yet, the judge remained calm. Her hand tightened slightly around her pen, but her face betrayed nothing. She listened, allowing him to continue, his words growing sharper and more poisonous. "It's almost comical," he sneered, feeding off the silence, daring anyone, to stop him. "This system wasn't made for people like you to lead. It was built for people like me, to uphold, to protect. And you're just here trying to prove something. But deep down, we all know you don't belong." The words hung in the air like a challenge, their weight pressing not just on her but on every soul in the room who had ever been told they didn't belong. The judge sat poised, her expression calm, though a fire seemed to burn beneath the surface. She leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but measured. "This is a courtroom, Officer Daniels," she said, her tone unwavering, "not a playground for your unchecked biases. If you cannot respect this space, you are free to leave." But Daniels didn't back down. His smirk widened, his words turning even more venomous. "Respect," he repeated mockingly. "Respect is earned, and you, Judge Clark, you've done nothing to earn mine." Whispers began rippling through the room. Even those who had tried to ignore the tension now found themselves drawn in. The confrontation had moved beyond the case. It was now about something deeper, a clash that exposed the raw wounds of a system that had long ignored its failures. Judge Clark finally rose from her seat, her presence commanding and unshakable. Authority radiated from her as though it were a tangible force. But before she could speak, Daniels took a step closer, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper that somehow echoed throughout the room. "You don't scare me," he said. "You're just pretending. Playing dress-up in a role you were never meant to have. And you know it." The silence in the room was deafening. Every pair of eyes was on her, waiting to see if the fire Daniels had ignited would consume her, or him. And then it came, the moment no one saw coming. Judge Clark's voice rang out, clear and unflinching, cutting through his condescension like a knife. "You think this is about me?" she said, her tone sharp and resolute. "You think you can intimidate me because of your badge, your arrogance, your ignorance? Let me remind you, Officer Daniels, that this courtroom does not run on your biases. It runs on justice, and justice will always silence people like you." The tension broke, but only for a second. Daniels' smirk faltered, his composure cracked, but instead of retreating, he stepped forward again, his hand raised in a gesture meant to silence her, to humiliate her publicly. The room collectively gasped. But Judge Clark didn't flinch. She didn't back down. Instead, she stood taller, her voice unwavering and electrifying. "You will regret this," she said, her tone calm but laced with unshakable conviction. "That's not a threat, officer. It's a promise." What followed sent shockwaves through the room. Witnesses who had sat passively moments before now reached for their phones, recording the exchange. Daniels, stunned by her defiance, stood exposed, his authority crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. And as the courtroom doors swung open, the whispers from outside grew louder, carrying with them a flood of questions. What would happen to him now? How far would Judge Clark go to ensure justice was served? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what had he underestimated in her resolve? This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The structured order of the courtroom stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the city outside. Towering ceilings loomed overhead, and shelves lined with law books, spines worn from years of use, framed the room. This was supposed to be a place where justice reigned, where principles triumphed over prejudice. It was here that Judge Naomi Ellis, a young black woman, had defied all odds to claim her seat on the bench. Naomi carried herself with a quiet but unshakable strength, one forged in the fires of systemic bias and relentless doubt. Her natural curls framed a face that radiated both serenity and determination. At just 38, she was one of the youngest judges in the district and the first black woman to serve in this courthouse. The milestone had won her admiration from her community, who saw her as a beacon of hope, but it had also made her a target for those who resented her very presence. Naomi's journey to the bench had been far from easy. She was raised in a modest neighborhood on the east side of Brookfield, a city marked by its stark divides. Her father, a civil rights lawyer, spent his life fighting for marginalized communities, while her mother, a school teacher, nurtured in Naomi a love for learning and an unshakable belief in fairness. As a child, Naomi had watched her parents labor tirelessly, their lives guided by a conviction that change could only happen from within the system. That belief became her foundation, even when she witnessed the world's harsh realities. Despite her impressive accomplishments, Naomi was no stranger to skepticism. She had earned her law degree from a top-tier university, graduated near the top of her class, and built a reputation as a sharp, fearless advocate for justice during her years as a prosecutor. But for some, her achievements were overshadowed by her race and gender. Many saw her skin color as a disqualifier and her authority as something to be undermined. The courthouse itself was a reflection of the world outside, its halls buzzing with a mix of respect and resentment. Some of Naomi's colleagues admired her intelligence and composure, while others viewed her as an intruder, someone who didn't belong in spaces they had claimed for themselves. Among her fiercest detractors was Officer Ryan Calder, a police veteran with nearly 20 years on the force. Calder was a man who wore his badge like armor, convinced it shielded him from accountability. His imposing frame, square jaw, and piercing blue eyes made him a figure of intimidation, and he wielded his authority like a weapon. To him, justice wasn't about fairness, but about maintaining control. Naomi's presence on the bench was a direct challenge to his worldview, a symbol of a shifting power dynamic he refused to accept. Their paths had crossed numerous times in courtrooms, where Naomi's rulings often went against officers like Calder. He had watched her dismiss cases where evidence was compromised, question the credibility of police reports, and hold law enforcement to account. To Calder, every decision Naomi made was a personal affront, a strike against the system he believed he embodied. The day their confrontation reached its boiling point, the tension had already been simmering. The case involved an 18-year-old black teen, Marcus Reed, accused of assaulting an officer during a routine traffic stop. The prosecution's evidence was flimsy, grainy footage that contradicted Calder's written account of the incident. The defense argued that this was yet another case of racial profiling. Naomi, as always, had made it clear that she would not tolerate shortcuts or biases in the pursuit of justice. For Calder, Naomi's scrutiny of the case felt like an attack on his authority. He had been the arresting officer, and her insistence on examining every detail struck him as a deliberate attempt to discredit him. The courtroom was packed that day. Reporters filled the gallery, pens poised to record every moment. Members of the community showed up to support Marcus, while rows of uniformed officers sat in solidarity with Calder, a silent, looming display of unity. When Naomi entered the room, her black robe flowing behind her, the noise subsided. Her expression was calm and unreadable, but there was an unmistakable fire in her eyes, a quiet determination to ensure the weight of the moment would not crush her. Calder sat at the prosecution's table, his presence impossible to ignore. His posture was stiff, his jaw clenched, and his icy gaze fixed on Naomi. He made no effort to hide his disdain. As the proceedings began, Calder's interruptions were frequent, his tone dripping with condescension. Each time, Naomi met him with steady composure, calmly redirecting his attempts to undermine her. Her voice never wavered, her authority remaining unshaken, even as the tension in the room continued to mount. Judge Naomi Ellis maintained her steady authority, but it was clear to everyone in the room that the tension between her and Officer Ryan Calder was growing. With every passing moment, the atmosphere thickened, like an invisible thread being pulled tighter and tighter. As the trial unfolded, the flaws in the prosecution's evidence became glaringly obvious. The defense painted a vivid picture of a young man, Marcus Reed, caught in a system that presumed his guilt before even considering his innocence. Naomi's questions were sharp and unrelenting. Her focus never wavered as she pressed the prosecution, exposing inconsistencies and gaps in their narrative. Her tone was firm but fair, a balancing act that left no room for misinterpretation. Meanwhile, Calder's frustration grew more visible with each passing moment. His face hardened, his jaw clenched, and his posture stiffened as he watched the case he had built begin to crumble. By the time the defense rested, the room was electric with anticipation. Naomi paused, letting the silence settle like a blanket over the buzzing courtroom. Her gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on the jury, the defense, and finally on Calder. When she spoke, her voice was calm, yet carried the weight of steel. Addressing the jury, she meticulously outlined the standards of evidence required for a conviction. It was clear that she would not allow prejudice or assumptions to dictate the outcome. For Calder, it was too much. His anger boiled over. He shot to his feet, the screech of his chair scraping against the floor echoing through the courtroom. All eyes turned to him as the tension reached a breaking point. The atmosphere shifted instantly, a sharp disruption to the fragile order Naomi had worked so hard to preserve. Calder's hostility was unmasked, etched deeply into his expression. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost as if he were daring someone to intervene. "Your Honor," he began, his voice low but seething with venom, "I have to question the integrity of these proceedings." A collective breath seemed to catch in the room. Naomi remained seated, her expression calm, though her fingers gripped the edge of the bench just slightly tighter. She took a measured pause before responding, her words deliberate and precise. "Officer Calder," she said evenly, "if you have concerns regarding these proceedings, you may voice them through the proper channels. However, this is neither the time nor the place to undermine this court." Calder smirked, leaning forward. His towering frame loomed over the desk in front of him as he spoke, his tone dripping with mockery. "Proper channels? You mean the ones set up to protect people like you when you overstep? When you're in over your head?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Disbelief and outrage mixed together in a wave of emotion. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she refused to give him the reaction he was baiting her for. Instead, she leaned back slightly, folding her hands in front of her, her voice steady as she replied, "I caution you, Officer Calder, against making statements irrelevant to the case at hand." But Calder wasn't finished. His smirk grew wider and his voice rose, no longer directed just at Naomi but at everyone in the room. "The case at hand?" he sneered. "Let's talk about that. We have a repeat offender who resisted arrest, attacked an officer, and now somehow he's the victim. This is a joke, a platform for you to push your agenda." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, and frantic scribbling from reporters filled the air. Naomi tapped her gavel twice, her voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. "This court will not tolerate personal attacks or baseless accusations. One more outburst, Officer Calder, and you will be held in contempt." But the threat didn't seem to register. Calder's glare intensified, his body radiating defiance. He took another step toward the bench, lowering his voice into a dangerous whisper that was loud enough for the room to hear. "You think you can control this courtroom? You can't even control what's being said about you outside these walls. People know what's happening here, Judge Ellis, and trust me, they're watching." Naomi met his stare head on, refusing to look away. "You're right," she said, her voice unwavering. "People are watching, which is exactly why I will continue to uphold the law without bias or intimidation. Now, sit down." For a moment, it looked as though Calder might push further. His fists clenched at his sides, and his body radiated barely contained rage. But then, with a scoff, he dropped back into his seat. His frustration was evident in every tense movement, his jaw tight and his shoulders stiff. As the courtroom settled, the proceedings resumed, though the air remained charged with tension. Witnesses testified to the inconsistencies in the police report. Grainy video footage revealed glaring gaps in Calder's version of events. Piece by piece, the defense chipped away at the foundation of his case, exposing cracks that couldn't be ignored. By the time the defense rested, the room was alive with unspoken energy. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Every person in the gallery hanging on what would come next. When the court adjourned for the day, Naomi retreated to her chambers, her mind racing with the weight of the day's events. The tension between herself and Calder had reached a boiling point, and she knew that what lay ahead would only become more intense. Naomi Ellis carried the weight of the case on her shoulders, but she refused to let it break her resolve. She knew that this trial wasn't just about Marcus Reed's freedom. It was about something far larger, a fight for accountability and justice in a system that resisted change at every turn. The hostility she faced from Officer Ryan Calder and his supporters was a sharp reminder of how deeply entrenched that resistance truly was. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, Calder paced the hallway like a storm barely contained. His frustration radiated from him, his anger spilling into sharp words. His colleagues hovered nearby, uneasy as they tried to calm him, but he waved them off, his voice rising. "This is a circus," Calder growled. "She's turning everything we stand for into a joke." A younger officer with a nervous expression finally spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Ryan, maybe it's not worth it. You're letting this get too personal." Calder whirled around, his piercing blue eyes blazing. "Personal? You think this isn't personal for her? She's using that bench to dismantle everything we've built. If we let her win, it sets a precedent we can't afford." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the reporters lingering nearby. "Maybe we should let the evidence speak for itself. Pushing this too hard, it could backfire." Calder's jaw tightened as he shook his head. "Backfire? What's happening in there is what happens when you let people like her take over. Someone needs to remind her who really runs this city." As the evening settled over the courthouse, both Naomi and Calder prepared for the next day's hearing in their own ways. Naomi stayed in her chambers, poring over the case files late into the night. Her exhaustion was palpable, but her determination outweighed it. She knew the odds weren't just stacked against Marcus, they were stacked against her as well. The unspoken biases that filled every corner of the system felt like an invisible force pressing against her. Yet she resolved to move forward, no matter the cost. Calder, on the other hand, wasn't relying on the courtroom to make his point. Fueled by anger and entitlement, he made phone calls, rallying those who shared his views. For him, this trial wasn't about justice, it was about power, about control. Losing wasn't an option he was willing to entertain. The following day, the tension in the courtroom was even more palpable. Reporters jostled for position, their notebooks and cameras ready to capture every moment. Community members packed the seats, their faces tense with anticipation. Naomi entered, her black robe flowing behind her like armor. She felt the weight of every gaze on her but refused to let it show. With a calm, practiced motion, she adjusted her robe, took her seat, and prepared to continue the proceedings. Calder was already seated, his expression hardened and unreadable. But as the hearing resumed, it became increasingly clear that his case was crumbling. The defense's arguments were airtight, their evidence too compelling to ignore. Each point they raised seemed to push Calder closer to the edge, his frustration visible to anyone paying attention. And then it happened. A flicker of something, unease perhaps, crossed Calder's face as the defense questioned a key piece of evidence. The moment was fleeting, so subtle that most people in the room missed it. But Naomi didn't. That brief crack in his composure sparked something in her. A curiosity, a sense that there was more to his story than met the eye. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. Naomi adjourned the hearing, her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't yet see how the pieces fit together, but she sensed that the truth was closer than ever. When it finally came to light, it wouldn't just shift the course of the trial, it would change everything. The next day the courtroom was quieter, but the silence carried an oppressive weight. It pressed against every person in the room, charged with anticipation. Naomi sat at her bench, her hands resting lightly on the desk. She appeared composed, but inside, her thoughts raced. The defense's final argument had been devastatingly strong, and the cracks in the prosecution's case were now impossible to ignore. Across the room, Calder sat rigid in his seat. His jaw was tight, and his fists clenched on the table before him. He hadn't spoken since the last witness had been dismissed, but his silence was louder than any outburst. His cold gaze bore into Naomi, as though he believed he could will her to falter through sheer force of disdain. But Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge him as the tension between them grew unbearable. The defense attorney, a sharp and methodical man named Elliot Grant, rose to his feet. His voice cut through the stillness of the room, calm but deliberate. He held a paper in his hand, and though it trembled slightly, it wasn't from nerves. It was from the sheer gravity of what he was about to reveal. "Your Honor," Grant began, his voice steady, "as we've demonstrated, the prosecution's narrative relies heavily on Officer Calder's testimony. However, there's something critical that hasn't been addressed, something that could shed light on his motivations." Naomi straightened slightly in her chair, her attention fixed on him. She hadn't anticipated this revelation. There had been no indication that the defense was holding back something so significant. The jury leaned forward in their seats, every pair of eyes locked on Grant as he continued. Grant took a breath, his tone measured but weighty. "We have obtained records that reveal a troubling history of misconduct by Officer Calder, complaints filed against him, many of which involve allegations of racial bias and excessive force. These records were not disclosed by the prosecution, despite their clear relevance to this case." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, pens flying across notepads and cameras clicking furiously. Naomi tapped her gavel, calling for order, but the weight of the moment was impossible to contain. The truth wasn't just inching its way into the light. It was about to explode. The courtroom was taut with tension, the air thick with anticipation as the defense attorney Elliot Grant stood before Judge Naomi Ellis holding a report in his hand. The jury leaned forward, captivated, their eyes fixed on him. Naomi, ever composed, sensed a shift, though there had been no prior indication that Grant was about to deliver a revelation that could upend everything. "Your Honor," Grant began, his voice steady and deliberate, "we have obtained records indicating that Officer Ryan Calder has a documented history of misconduct complaints, many involving racially motivated incidents. These records were not disclosed by the prosecution, despite their clear relevance to this case." A murmur rippled through the room, growing louder with each passing second. Reporters frantically jotted down notes while their cameras clicked and flashed. Members of the jury exchanged wide-eyed glances, their expressions betraying shock and disbelief. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't just another piece of evidence. It was a bombshell. Raising her hand, she called firmly over the noise. "Order in the court." Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Turning to Grant, she asked, "Counsel, are you prepared to substantiate these claims?" Grant nodded, his face resolute. "Yes, Your Honor." These records were filed with the Internal Affairs Division of the Police Department but were never acted upon. Furthermore, we have corroborating witness statements that establish a clear pattern of Officer Calder targeting individuals based on race. Naomi's gaze shifted to Calder, who had gone pale. The man who had exuded nothing but arrogance and bravado throughout the trial now seemed visibly shaken. His carefully constructed facade of authority was beginning to crack, and the tension in his body betrayed his crumbling composure. Suddenly, Calder stood, his voice sharp and defensive. "This is a smear campaign, Your Honor. They're trying to undermine my credibility because they know they're losing." Naomi's eyes locked onto his. Her tone remained calm but carried an undeniable edge. "Officer Calder, you will have the opportunity to respond when called upon. For now, I suggest you remain seated." Calder opened his mouth to argue, but something in Naomi's gaze stopped him. Reluctantly, he sank back into his seat, though his posture remained rigid, his fists clenched tightly on the table. Grant turned to the jury, his voice firm but measured. "This isn't just about one arrest. It's about a pattern of behavior, a pattern that calls into question the very foundation of this case. If Officer Calder has a documented history of falsifying reports or targeting individuals unjustly, how can his account of what happened on that night be trusted?" The weight of Grant's words hung in the air, reverberating through the room. Naomi allowed the silence to settle before speaking. "This court will recess for 1 hour to allow both sides to review this new evidence. We will reconvene promptly." She struck the gavel, the sound reverberating sharply as the room erupted into chaos. Reporters swarmed toward Grant, microphones and cameras thrust in his direction. Community members whispered furiously among themselves, their voices a low hum of anger and vindication. Naomi retreated to her chambers, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could feel the cracks forming, not just in the prosecution's case, but in the wall of invincibility Calder had built around himself. For the first time she had seen something she hadn't expected, fear in Calder's eyes, and it unsettled her. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Calder confronted the lead prosecutor, his voice a harsh, furious whisper. "You didn't tell me they had this. How the hell did this happen?" The prosecutor, clearly flustered, raised his hands defensively. "I didn't know. That wasn't in the files we reviewed." Calder stepped closer, lowering his voice, though the intensity remained. "Fix it. I don't care what you have to do. Just fix it." The prosecutor shook his head, his voice heavy with resignation. "It's too late. The jury's seen it. They've heard it. We can't unring that bell." Calder swore under his breath, his frustration boiling over. Without another word, he stormed down the hallway, ignoring the reporters who called after him. Outside, the sky had darkened, heavy clouds threatening rain, a reflection of the storm brewing within him. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was different. The air was charged, humming with anticipation. Everyone in the room knew something irreversible was about to happen. Naomi resumed her seat, her face calm but her mind alert. The defense presented the evidence in painstaking detail, laying out a damning timeline of complaints and incidents involving Calder. Each revelation hit harder than the last, eroding the prosecution's case until it was nearly unrecognizable. Calder sat rigid, his face a mask of defiance, but his eyes betrayed him, darting nervously toward the jury, the gallery, and finally toward Naomi, as though searching for an escape that didn't exist. When the defense rested, Calder rose again. This time he addressed Naomi directly. "Your Honor, this is a farce. You're letting them destroy my reputation, my career, based on unsubstantiated claims." Naomi met his gaze, her voice steady but laced with authority. "Officer Calder, the evidence presented is now a matter of record. If you wish to refute it, you may do so under oath." For a moment it seemed as though Calder might take the stand. He hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he weighed his options. But then, he faltered. The silence that followed spoke louder than any words could have. Naomi let the moment linger before turning back to the court. "The jury will now review the evidence and deliberate. This court is adjourned until further notice." She struck the gavel once more, and the room erupted into motion. As Naomi left the bench and returned to her chambers, she felt the enormity of what had just unfolded. Calder's credibility was shattered, his once impenetrable authority reduced to rubble. The truth was finally emerging, and it would change everything. Judge Naomi Ellis turned her attention to the jury, her expression calm yet unreadable. Her voice carried through the room with quiet authority. "The court will now recess for deliberation. The jury is instructed to weigh the evidence carefully and return with a verdict." As the jury filed out, Naomi's gaze flicked to Officer Ryan Calder once more. His arrogance, once unwavering, had eroded, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Naomi had seen men like him before, men who believed their power made them untouchable. But today, the cracks were showing. Today, justice felt closer than it ever had. As the door closed behind the jury, the weight of what was coming settled over the room like a brewing storm. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, the air so heavy it felt as though everyone was holding their breath in unison. Naomi sat at her bench, her face a mask of composure, though her mind raced. The defense had just unearthed a key inconsistency in the evidence, a small but crucial crack in the prosecution's case. It was subtle, but it carried the potential to unravel everything. Naomi knew this was not something Calder had anticipated. His earlier bravado now seemed more like desperation poorly disguised. Calder stood at the prosecution table, his body stiff, his fists pressed tightly against the edge of the desk. When he spoke, his voice carried a sharp edge, though the panic beneath it was unmistakable. "This is ridiculous," Calder barked. "We're really going to let a single discrepancy overshadow the entire case?" This is what happens when we coddle criminals and ignore the sacrifices of law enforcement. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto Calder's. Her voice was measured and firm. Officer Calder, this court is concerned with the facts, not emotional appeals. The evidence is either reliable or it isn't. My duty is to ensure that only the truth informs the jury's decision. Calder glared at her, his jaw tightening as he bit back a retort. And who gets to decide what's true? You. A judge more interested in making a statement than in delivering justice. The room erupted into murmurs. Spectators too engrossed in the drama to remember courtroom decorum. Naomi tapped her gavel twice, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Order. This is your final warning, Officer Calder. If you cannot maintain professionalism, I will hold you in contempt. Calder's lips curled into a smirk, though the smile never reached his eyes. Of course, Your Honor. Professionalism. The defense attorney, Elliot Grant, a young and sharp litigator with a calculating demeanor, rose from his seat. His expression was neutral, but his tone carried a quiet confidence. Your Honor, the defense would like to present additional documentation to support our claim of inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence. Calder's head snapped toward Grant, his face flushing with anger. What documentation? This is a stunt, an attempt to derail the case because they know their client is guilty. Naomi's voice remained steady but firm. Proceed, Mr. Grant. Grant handed a folder to the bailiff, who carried it to Naomi. She opened it and flipped through the pages. Her brow furrowed slightly as she examined the documents. They were meticulously detailed, highlighting a troubling pattern that could not be ignored. Calder shifted uneasily in his seat, his fingers tapping against the table, a nervous energy that betrayed the calm front he was trying to maintain. Grant spoke with deliberate clarity, his voice echoing through the room. These records show a history of falsified reports submitted by Officer Calder in cases involving young black men. The inconsistencies are not isolated to this case. They form a clear pattern that calls into question his credibility as both a witness and an investigator. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, the weight of the revelation rippling through the room like an earthquake. Naomi set the folder down, her face unreadable as she turned her attention to Calder. Officer Calder, she began, her voice calm but pointed. Do you wish to respond to these allegations? Calder's face darkened. His voice rose, laced with frustration. This is absurd. These are baseless accusations, and I won't sit here and be slandered in front of this entire courtroom. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. This court is not slandering you, Officer Calder. It is examining evidence, which is its duty. Do you deny that these reports were altered? Calder hesitated. The pause stretched longer than it should have, the silence speaking volumes. The spectators leaned forward in their seats, sensing that the case, and Calder's carefully maintained facade, was unraveling. Finally, he snapped, his voice brimming with frustration. I did what I had to do to ensure justice. Sometimes the system doesn't work the way it should, and tough calls have to be made. But I never lied. Grant seized the moment, his tone sharp and precise. Ensuring justice by falsifying records, Officer Calder? That's a dangerous justification, especially when it disproportionately affects certain communities. Calder's anger boiled over, his voice rose again, trembling with indignation. You have no idea what it's like out there. You sit in your offices and courtrooms, pretending to understand the reality of the streets. You don't know what it's like to face danger every single day, to deal with people who hate you for wearing the badge. Naomi's voice cut through his tirade, calm but commanding. And does that justify compromising the integrity of the system you claim to protect? Does it justify targeting individuals based on their race, or bending the rules to suit your narrative? The courtroom fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Calder glanced around the room, his eyes darting toward the gallery, the jury, and Naomi. He looked cornered, his confidence shattered. Naomi exhaled quietly, her tone measured as she addressed the court. This trial is about truth and accountability, not about personal vendettas or unchecked authority. This court will not tolerate any behavior that undermines those principles. She turned back to the jury, her expression steady. The evidence presented will be weighed carefully, as is your duty. Justice demands nothing less. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. the cracks in Calder's narrative now too large to ignore. Judge Naomi Ellis's voice sliced through the air, calm but commanding. And does that justify compromising the very integrity of the system you claim to protect? Does it justify targeting individuals based on their race or bending the rules to fit your narrative? Ryan Calder's silence was damning. His jaw tightened as he looked away, his eyes darting toward the uniformed officers seated in the gallery. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions revealing a mix of loyalty and doubt. Calder had been their leader, their example. But now, that example was crumbling under scrutiny. Naomi exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. She addressed the court, her voice steady despite the immense tension in the room. This is not just about one case or one defendant. It is about the principles we uphold, the integrity of the system, and the trust that the public places in us. If we fail to hold ourselves accountable, we fail the very people we are meant to serve. The room fell into a stunned silence. Naomi's words landed with the weight of truth, rippling through everyone present. Calder seemed to shrink in his seat, his once unwavering confidence diminished. For the first time, he looked small, his authority questioned, his arrogance peeled away. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The truth was laid bare, and there was no escaping it. Naomi struck her gavel and adjourned the court for the day, leaving everyone to process what had just unfolded. As she walked back to her chambers, the burden of the case pressed heavily on her shoulders. Yet she knew one thing with certainty: the fight for justice wasn't over. What came next would decide not only the outcome of this case, but the future of those who relied on the system to deliver accountability. The courtroom was quieter than it had been in days, but the tension was just as suffocating. Everyone present understood they were witnessing the fallout of something monumental. The case had grown far beyond a single defendant. It had become a flashpoint for a much larger battle over accountability and power. Every word spoken now carried weight far greater than the trial itself. When Naomi entered the courtroom, her expression was as unreadable as ever. But to those who had observed her closely over the past week, there was a faint shadow of exhaustion in her eyes. It wasn't from lack of sleep. It was the weariness of navigating a system designed to test her resolve at every turn. She took her seat, adjusted her robe, and gave a measured nod to the bailiff. The trial resumed, though the atmosphere was palpably different. This was no longer just about Marcus Reed's case. It was about exposing and holding accountable a system that had failed far too many. The defense attorney, Evelyn Reyes, stood confidently. The cracks in Calder's defense had already begun to show, and Evelyn carried herself with the conviction of someone who knew the tide was turning. Her voice was steady, each word deliberate as she addressed the court. "Your Honor," Evelyn began, "the defense requests to introduce one final witness. However, this individual has direct knowledge of Officer Calder's conduct and can speak to the broader implications of his actions." Naomi's gaze swept the room, her eyes briefly landing on Calder before returning to Evelyn. "You may proceed." The courtroom door creaked open, and a young man stepped inside. He was younger than most had expected, his nervous energy apparent in the way he carried himself. His eyes darted toward the jury, then to Naomi, before finally settling on Evelyn. Evelyn approached him gently, her tone calm and encouraging. "Please state your name and occupation for the record." The man cleared his throat, his voice just above a whisper. "My name is Brandon Tate. I'm a former officer with the department." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Even Naomi, though composed, couldn't ignore the significance of the moment. Evelyn pressed on. "Mr. Tate, you recently resigned from the police force. Can you explain why?" Brandon hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously toward Calder, whose expression had turned cold and unyielding. Brandon took a deep breath and steadied himself. "I left because I couldn't do it anymore. The lies, the cover-ups, the way certain communities were treated, it wasn't what I signed up for." The murmurs in the gallery began to grow louder, but Evelyn stayed composed. "When you say the way certain communities were treated, are you referring to specific instances or a broader pattern?" Brandon's hands gripped the edges of the witness stand, his knuckles whitening. "Both," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "There were cases like this one, where evidence was manipulated to make the suspect look guilty. Reports were altered, and officers were encouraged to stick to a story even if it wasn't true. But it wasn't just about individual cases, it was a mindset. Certain neighborhoods were treated like war zones, and the people living there weren't seen as citizens, they were seen as threats. The murmurs swelled into a low roar, prompting Naomi to raise her hand. Her voice was steady but firm. "Order in the court." Turning back to Brandon, she asked, "Mr. Tate, I need you to be specific. Are you alleging that Officer Calder engaged in this behavior?" Brandon hesitated, his eyes meeting Naomi's. Then he glanced at Calder, whose face now betrayed a thinly veiled rage. Brandon swallowed hard, but when he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. "Yes, Calder was one of the worst. He didn't just follow orders, he gave them. He told us to find reasons to make arrests, to stop people, and if we couldn't find a reason, we made one." The gallery erupted into gasps and whispers, reporters scribbling furiously as cameras clicked. Calder shot to his feet, his voice sharp and indignant. "This is a joke. He's a disgruntled ex-cop with an axe to grind." Naomi struck her gavel sharply. "Officer Calder, sit down. You will have the opportunity to respond in due course." Reluctantly, Calder obeyed, his fists clenched at his sides as he glared at Brandon. Evelyn, seizing the moment, turned back to Brandon. "And yet you've chosen to come forward today." "Why, Mr. Tate?" Brandon's gaze drifted to Naomi before settling back on Evelyn. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I'm tired of staying silent while people like Calder ruin lives. And because if we don't start holding people accountable, nothing will ever change." The silence that followed was different. Heavy, not with tension, but with the gravity of Brandon's words. "Yes, he was one of the worst," Brandon Tate said, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "He didn't just follow orders, he gave them. He told us to make arrests, to find reasons to stop people, to clean up the streets, as he put it. And if we couldn't find a reason, we made one." The room collectively gasped, the tension snapping like a taut rope. Officer Ryan Calder shot to his feet, his voice booming. "This is a joke. He's just a disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind. He's lying, and everyone here knows it." Judge Naomi Ellis's gavel struck sharply, cutting through the rising commotion. Her voice was firm, a command that left no room for argument. "Sit down, Officer Calder. You'll have your chance to respond." Reluctantly, Calder obeyed. His jaw was so tightly clenched it seemed as though it might shatter. His fists rested on the table, white-knuckled and trembling with rage. Brandon's voice grew steadier as he pressed on. "It's not just me. There are others who've seen it, other officers who know what's been happening, but they're too scared to come forward. The culture in the department doesn't allow dissent. If you speak out, you're ostracized or worse." Evelyn Reyes seized the moment. Her tone was calm but probing. "And yet you've chosen to come forward today, Mr. Tate. Why?" Brandon's eyes flicked toward Naomi briefly before returning to Evelyn. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I'm tired of staying silent while people like Officer Calder destroy lives. And because if we don't start holding people accountable, nothing will ever change." The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't just tension, it was a collective reckoning. Brandon's words settled over everyone like a dense fog, impossible to ignore or dispel. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze focused on Brandon. "Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Tate. Your courage in coming forward is noted." But Calder wasn't finished. He stood again, his face flushed with anger. "This is a smear campaign. None of this is relevant to the case at hand. This is about one suspect and one incident, not some grand conspiracy." Naomi's eyes locked onto him, her tone sharper this time. "Sit down, Officer Calder. This court will determine what is relevant." Calder hesitated for a moment, his defiance evident, but slowly he sank back into his seat. His frustration simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any second. Naomi allowed the silence to linger for a moment before turning back to Evelyn. "Does the defense have anything further?" Evelyn shook her head, her voice steady. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Naomi exhaled quietly, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the bench. Addressing the jury, she spoke with deliberate authority. "This court has been presented with a great deal of evidence, much of which calls into question the integrity of the case before us. It is now your duty to determine the truth and ensure that justice is served." As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the room buzzed with an energy that felt both electric and somber. The trial wasn't over, but the truth was now out in the open. Nothing would ever be the same. Naomi remained seated, her eyes scanning the courtroom as people filed out in clusters. Some whispered in hushed tones, their voices carrying disbelief and anger. Others moved in silence, their faces a mix of shock and contemplation. Officer Calder, however, stayed rooted at the prosecution table, his gaze fixed on Naomi like a quiet storm brewing behind his icy eyes. Evelyn gathered her papers with calm precision, her satisfaction carefully contained. She could feel the tide turning, but knew better than to celebrate prematurely. As she slid the last file into her briefcase, Calder's voice cut through the room, low but unmistakable. "This isn't over," he said, his tone laced with venom. "You think you've won something, but you don't understand what you've started." Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his, her voice even but resolute. "Officer Calder, if you have anything to say that is relevant to the case, you may file a formal motion. Otherwise, I suggest you keep your comments to yourself." Calder ignored her, standing abruptly and turning toward Evelyn. His tone was sharp, his words dripping with contempt. "You and your client have made a mockery of this court, twisting facts, dragging my name through the mud, all to push your agenda. But let me tell you something. People like you don't change anything. You're a moment, not a movement." Evelyn didn't flinch. She straightened, her voice calm but resolute. "And people like you rely on that belief to stay in power. You think the system will always protect you, that accountability is for everyone else. But today proves otherwise. This is just the beginning." Calder scoffed, his laugh bitter and humorless. "You think you've exposed something new? The world doesn't care. They'll forget about this trial in a week, and I'll still be here." Naomi's voice cut through sharply, commanding and unyielding. "Enough, Officer Calder. Your conduct in this court has already been unacceptable, and I will not allow further disruption. Leave now or face contempt charges." For a moment it seemed as though Calder might push further. His hands clenched at his sides, and his body radiated barely contained rage. But then, without another word, he turned and stormed out of the courtroom. The door slammed shut behind him, echoing through the nearly empty room. Naomi sat back in her chair, her face unreadable as she watched the courtroom slowly empty. She knew that what came next would be the most critical step of all. This wasn't just about one case or one officer. It was about something far greater, a battle for accountability, justice, and the future of a broken system. Ryan Calder looked as though he might challenge her again, his fists clenched at his sides. But then he turned sharply, his footsteps heavy as he stormed out of the courtroom. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the emptying space like a punctuation mark on the day's tension. Judge Naomi Ellis exhaled slowly, her gaze lingering on the door for a moment before turning to Evelyn Reyes. "You handled yourself well today, Miss Reyes. This case is as much about persistence as it is about the facts, and you've demonstrated both." Evelyn gave a small appreciative nod, though her expression remained serious. "Thank you, Your Honor. But the fight isn't over yet. We still have to wait for the jury." Naomi nodded, the weight of the truth evident in her eyes. "It's out of our hands now. All we can do is trust that they'll see the truth." Hours passed. The courthouse, which had buzzed with tension all day, slowly emptied. The crowded halls grew quiet, and the charged energy dissipated into an uneasy calm. Naomi remained in her chambers, the soft glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. She thumbed through files, though her mind wasn't on the words before her. Instead, she reflected on the broader implications of the trial. This wasn't just about one case or one officer. It was about a system that had allowed men like Calder to operate unchecked for far too long. A knock at the door startled her out of her thoughts. She glanced up to see Evelyn standing there, her expression cautious but hopeful. "Your Honor," Evelyn said, her voice steady, "the jury has reached a verdict." Naomi nodded, rising from her chair. Donning her robe, she felt the weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders. She made her way back to the courtroom, each step deliberate. When Naomi re-entered the courtroom, the gallery had refilled. The mood was markedly different from before. Anticipation and anxiety now hung in the air like a dense fog. The tension was palpable, The jury filed in, their faces unreadable, as the foreperson handed a folded piece of paper to the bailiff. The bailiff carried it to Naomi, who unfolded it carefully. Her expression remained neutral as her eyes scanned the words. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the silence thick and oppressive. She handed the paper back to the bailiff and addressed the court, her voice steady but firm. "Will the defendant please rise?" Marcus Reed stood at the defense table, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Evelyn stood beside him, her presence calm and steady, a quiet reassurance in the face of uncertainty. Naomi turned to the jury, her voice carrying across the room. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreperson stood, their voice clear but heavy with emotion. "Yes, Your Honor." Naomi gave a small nod. "Please state your verdict." The foreperson's voice carried the weight of the moment. "On the charge of assaulting a police officer, we find the defendant not guilty." The words seemed to echo through the courtroom. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Then, the room erupted. Marcus's family cried out in relief, tears streaming down their faces as they clung to one another. Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, a small, triumphant smile breaking through her composure. Ryan Calder, seated at the prosecution table, looked as though the air had been sucked from his lungs. His face went pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a farce," he muttered, his voice rising with anger, "a complete miscarriage of justice." Naomi's gavel struck sharply, her voice cutting through the noise. "Order. Officer Calder, sit down or leave this courtroom immediately." For a moment, Calder hesitated, his body rigid with tension, but eventually he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound was final, like the closing of a chapter. Naomi turned to the room, her voice calm but firm. "This court is adjourned." As people began filing out, Naomi remained seated, watching as Marcus and his family embraced. Their relief was palpable, a stark contrast to the tension that had defined the trial. For a moment, Naomi allowed herself to feel a small measure of satisfaction. Justice, however imperfect, had been served. But she knew the fight wasn't over. This was one victory in a much larger battle, and there was still much work to be done. The courthouse grew quieter, the intensity of the trial finally giving way to a sense of closure. Naomi sat in her chambers, the muffled sounds of the bustling city outside barely reaching her. The verdict had been delivered, the jury had gone home, and the young man at the center of it all was free. But for Naomi, the work wasn't over. She leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath as she reflected on what the case had revealed, not just about Marcus, but about the system itself. A system that had allowed people like Calder to manipulate it for far too long. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Evelyn entered, her usual composed demeanor softened by the weight of the day. She held a folder in one hand and a small smile on her lips. "Your Honor, I just wanted to thank you before I head out," Evelyn said. "Your fairness, your strength, it made all the difference." Naomi returned the smile, a tired but genuine expression crossing her face. "The credit belongs to you and your client. You fought for the truth, and that's what this court is here to uphold." Evelyn hesitated, her smile fading slightly as her tone turned serious. "Calder won't stop here. Men like him don't take defeat lightly. Be careful." Naomi nodded, her expression resolute. "I faced people like him my entire career, Miss Rise. They thrive on fear and intimidation, but they're powerless against resilience and accountability. Today wasn't just a victory for this case, it was a message." Evelyn nodded, her confidence bolstered. "Thank you, Your Honor, for everything." As Evelyn left, Naomi turned her attention to the files scattered across her desk. The trial was over, but the work of holding the system accountable was only beginning. Naomi Ellis returned Evelyn Rise's gratitude with a weary but genuine smile. "The credit belongs to you and your client. You fought for the truth, and that's what this court exists to uphold." Evelyn hesitated, her smile fading slightly as her tone turned serious. "Officer Calder won't stop here. Men like him don't take defeat lightly. Be careful, Your Honor." Naomi's expression grew firm, her resolve evident. "I've faced men like him my entire career, Miss Rise. They thrive on fear and intimidation, but they're powerless against resilience and accountability. Today wasn't just a victory for this case, it was a message. As Evelyn left, Naomi's gaze fell to the papers scattered across her desk. Among them was the file that had exposed Calder's carefully constructed facade. She flipped through it, her mind racing with the implications of what had come to light. His pattern of behavior, his willingness to bend the truth to suit his narrative, had been laid bare. But a troubling question lingered in her thoughts. How many more like him were still operating unchecked? In stark contrast to Naomi's quiet resolve, Ryan Calder's world was unraveling. He sat alone in his car, the engine off, the oppressive silence surrounding him, mirroring the turmoil in his mind. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he replayed the events of the trial over and over. The carefully cultivated image he had relied on for years, untouchable, respected, authoritative, was now shattered. His credibility had been obliterated, his actions scrutinized in ways he never anticipated. The fallout was just beginning. Internal investigations had already been launched. His name splashed across headlines, each story peeling away another layer of the protection he had once taken for granted. The phone on his dashboard buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. Support from his peers was waning. Allies who had once stood by him were now quietly distancing themselves as the evidence against him mounted. Calder had always believed himself untouchable, his badge a shield against accountability. Now he was learning just how fragile that shield truly was when the truth came to light. For Marcus Reed, the young man at the heart of the trial, freedom felt surreal. As he walked out of the courthouse, his family surrounded him. His mother's tears soaked his shoulder as she clung to him, her relief tangible. Marcus felt as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. Yet beneath his relief, anger and frustration simmered. What he had endured was a stark reminder of a system that saw people like him as guilty before proven innocent. As he glanced back at the courthouse, the place where his life had nearly been taken from him, he silently vowed that he would do everything in his power to ensure no one else had to endure the same ordeal. Days later, headlines across the city shifted. Under mounting pressure and facing a growing list of allegations, Officer Calder resigned from the force. Investigations revealed a pattern of misconduct that extended far beyond Naomi's courtroom, implicating not just Calder, but also others who had enabled and covered for him. The police department, now under intense scrutiny from both the public and the media, announced sweeping reforms. Independent oversight committees were established, and mandatory training programs were introduced to address the biases that had allowed officers like Calder to thrive unchecked for so long. For Naomi, the news was a validation of everything she had fought for during the trial. But it was also a sobering reminder of how much work remained. Change was slow, often met with resistance, but it was possible. A week after the trial, Naomi attended a community meeting. The room was filled with people who had come to discuss ways to hold the justice system accountable. Naomi stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding yet approachable. Her words, calling for unity and vigilance, were met with applause. For many in the room, she had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that change was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. Marcus, too, found himself drawn to advocacy. He began visiting schools, sharing his story with young people. He encouraged them to understand their rights, to believe in their worth, and to stand against injustice. His voice carried the weight of his experience, and his passion resonated deeply with those who heard him. Marcus refused to let his ordeal define him as a victim. Instead, he chose to become a force for change. Naomi followed his progress with pride. Marcus's resilience was a testament to the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. He had taken his pain and turned it into a source of strength, not just for himself, but for others. Naomi returned to her work on the bench, her rulings a reflection of her unwavering commitment to justice. The trial had been one chapter in a much larger story, but it was a chapter that had sparked something bigger. A movement toward accountability, toward equity, and toward a future where the truth could no longer be ignored. As the dust began to settle, Naomi sat in her chambers, looking out the window at the city skyline. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the challenges she had faced, the battles she had fought, and the victories she had earned. She knew there would always be more to do, more people to help, more systems to change. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet sense of peace, a reassurance that her work mattered and that she was exactly where she was meant to be. This story reminds us of the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds feel insurmountable. It's a story about accountability, about holding those in positions of power responsible for their actions, and about the strength it takes to fight for justice in a system that sometimes feels designed to resist it. It challenges us to reflect on our own roles in creating change, urging us to question and dismantle the systems and mindsets that perpetuate inequality. How did this story make you feel? Did you see yourself in any of the characters or their struggles? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Justice for more stories that inspire, challenge, and leave you thinking long after they're over. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.